We are very fortunate to have you here. You brought us a series of experiences and beautiful buildings, and yesterday's lecture was really very special for us, for our students, and for the general public that was able to visit us and take the advantage of seeing these wonderful buildings. One of the first things that comes to my mind when seeing your steps into architecture and how you were able to eventually decide to leave Italy and go to Japan and increase your realm of experiences and grow as an architect was that you were in the school of Florence in a particular moment, the end of 80s and the beginning of the 90s. This was some 20 years after Florence had been leading on a world level as one of the most interesting and controversial schools.
Yes, it's true.
I recall Archizoom and UFO and all the movements that were started in the 60s. And I would like to understand, from your point of view, how that particular revolutionary moment in the history of Florence, of the School of Architecture in Florence, was somehow permeated into those next years when you studied. That was.
This is a good question. In fact, when I decided to go to Florence, I didn't know about that. But then I found that there was an interesting school of architecture. Some part of the professors were more about conservation, restoration, and so on. But on the other side, there were still professors coming from that experience of the 70s, like Superstudio, Adolfo Natalini, professor, or Archizoom, or UFO. And so in that period, they made experimentation of very interesting contemporary architecture. And still in the composition examination, we had the chance to continue that kind of experimentation. Especially some professors were following the deconstructivist movement. So we made a lot of composition examination following deconstruction. But at the same time, I had the chance to work also with Adolfo Natalini, and who was the founder of Superstudio. It was very interesting experience for me. Yeah.
It's very interesting to note, now that you mentioned Superstudio and Natalini, who was your professor and was one of the leading minds of these revolutionary movements in the late 60s. According to what I was able to hear from Zaha Hadid in one of our discussions, in those little discussions that we could have between the workshops, the School of Florence, with those movements, was an influence to the deconstructivists because they broke boundaries. They thought of a different scale. They were far beyond what was the general discussion in terms of modernism, and a bit later on postmodernism. These minds were above and beyond that. They were trying to break all the rules and the proportions, the way the city was conceived, and the whole phenomenology. This came way before all the digital era, or all what that was enabling this type of operations later on.
Yeah. It was a very interesting period of experimentation of architecture. Especially they used the Biennale in Venice as a moment to express different research of experimentation in architecture. Yeah. In fact, for example, I was surprised when I went to Japan and I became a associate of Isozaki. Isozaki was a good friend of Adolfo Natalini because in that period for him it was one of the most interesting movements all over the world. And so from many countries, US, Japan, Europe, Italy, all the people were meeting at Biennale and so on and exchanging this kind of avant-garde of architecture.
And Arata was a curator for the Biennale for one event.
Just for the Japanese pavilion, not for the Biennale. Yeah. But they had established a long friendship with Adolfo Natalini, because at that time Italy was an interesting point of attraction for all the architects from all over the world. Yeah.
And so this leads me to the second moment in your life, the second moment where you decide, I am not going to stay here, I want to go abroad. And in one of our discussions you told me that you foresaw that Japan was leading into the future, and you even portrayed it as you were attracted to this Blade Runner feeling that it was in the air in those years in the 90s. Could you expand on that?
Yes, I enjoyed very much living in Japan because it was a completely different experience from Italy. Especially the city of Tokyo is a very particular experience because they have any kind of things is completely different from the European culture. First of all, the apartments are very small and the buildings are just made by steel or timber, and so not brick buildings or concrete buildings. The buildings are demolished usually after 25 years. So for me, it was impressed of this, how a city can easily change so quickly. In fact, for example, the buildings near my apartment, most of them changed in 7 years when I stayed in Tokyo. So it's impressive that you open the window and the building beside you is different. Or the speed also was a very important, another important element that impressed me. Because in Japan, especially in Tokyo, everything is very fast. You have the impression of the fast of the time when you go back to Europe. When you go back to Europe and you go out of the airplane, everything seems much slower. You have a really different impression of the feeling of time. And then I started working with Isozaki, I became his associate, and everything was very exciting. So we were working about competition and projects all over the world, especially in Qatar. I was responsible for the Qatar projects. And so I started when I was just 20 years old to travel 24 hours from Tokyo to Qatar and to meet a sheikh, to make a new museum there. So it was very interesting and very exciting.
This is one of the events in your life that was really key. The moment you decide to go to Japan, the moment that you are received by Isozaki. Isozaki was a myth. He was probably the most significant living Japanese architect at that time. And by getting closer to him as you were working there, and you were there for 6 years in Japan, you managed to grab a whole series of experiences, of life experiences that Arata himself had, like his link to the metabolist movement, the Kenzo Tange times where he was one of the leading architects in his studio.
His office, yes.
Having been close to him, what do you recall in his own words that was significant of that time of Arata Isozaki being with Kenzo?
Well, he was here. He remembers his experience with Kenzo Tange in many projects. When we had the meeting for new projects and so on, many times he was mentioning maybe the master plan he designed when he was with Kenzo Tange. Or, for example, for the ice hockey stadium, I showed you yesterday some images of the roof he did for the Expo, International Expo in Osaka in the 60s. He found, Kenzo Tange left in Isozaki a very important experience in his culture and idea of architecture. Probably because, I mean, Kenzo Tange anyway worked all over the world. He had a very open mind. His architecture was not just aesthetic, was very based on a close relationship between structure, function, and experimentation. Kenzo Tange did very interesting experimentation in that period on many kind of building and the new way of living, museum, office building and so on. For example, in Italy we have the experience of the tower he designed in the fair of Bologna that are still very interesting, and that the city of Bologna still continue building. The last tower was completed in 2006, I found. So he made a kind of architecture that the client can continue also by himself. So he was one of the most interesting architects, and Isozaki learned a lot from him, and is still always referring to his experience with him.
How you are able as an architect today to work with a very different scale. You are able to go from something intimate, small, as the library, and get to the Palahokki or the Alliance Tower, and are able to work both scales, both massive buildings and intimate and very delicate ones, with the same enthusiasm, the same sensibility. And this is something that I find very intriguing, because some architects, they just specialize in a given product. Andrea Maffei architects nowadays is dealing with all sorts of different purposes, functions, and sizes of buildings. And you must find this as something of a challenge, to keep changing the scale of what you are engaging into doing.
Yes, this is true. You know, the problem I think is the starting point of an architect. I mean, there are some architects who want to specialize in some issue, and they like this and they want to concentrate on that one. My approach is different. I like very much experimentation, so any kind of project for me is fine to become an experiment. First of all, also with myself, of what I want to, how I want to interpret that kind of building or that kind of master plan or that kind of small building in my idea of architecture. So for me, large scale or small scale is not the point. The point is how that project can start for me a new experience, a new way of experimentation in my idea of architecture. This is the starting point.
And then this leads me to the third stage, when after that 6 years experience and your growth in the offices of Isozaki, at that moment you decide to engage in the Palahokki Stadium, and you switch back to Italy, and it was a comeback to the slower pace of Italy and to a major challenge in a city, Torino, that was going through a very special moment. Yeah. How did you find that to be a challenge, and how in a specific way did it engage you?
Well, it was a very exciting project, first of all, because it was for the Winter Olympic Games. So it was an important building because it was one of the most important of the Olympic event. And especially because the building could be a chance to change completely one piece of the city, because it was not just a palace, but the project was including a park, a street that we changed in a new square of the city, other small sport facility. So it was the idea of designing a new city of sport for the city of Turin. and not just a single building. And this so was an interesting, was very exciting to make experimentation. And from another point of view, because we wanted to create a structure that could be easily used after Olympics. So we didn't start just to design a beautiful building, but first of all we started with the question, how can we make a sports hall that can be easily used after Olympic, also for concert, fairs, exhibition, any kind of thing, so that this building can continue to work for the local community. And starting on that, we developed the maximum flexibility of the building like if the building was a covered square, covered plaza, supported just by 8 columns, in which inside could be any kind of event. In fact, after Olympic, they used for rock concert, musical, for fair, for many kind of exhibition. And so it's still going on and it's still working for the city of Turin.
Do you consider that at the end, the essence of what was permeated, what was designed from the beginning, was accomplished?
Yes, I think finally we kept almost all the contents of the project from the beginning. The master plan is the same that we did in the competition phase. There were some changes a bit maybe about the central park, but we kept the 3 tower with the subway station in the center. The only thing we lost this contemporary art museum because the municipality decided they didn't have the money to continue to manage this kind of museum. But at the same time, Zaha Hadid housing were built, Libeskind were built, and so the project was half realized, and the general philosophy is still the same of the original project.
The design museum was also gone, so that gave a lot of extra room on the north part.
Yes, the client decided to use more for apartments to increase the residential area, yeah.
Nowadays, you are engaged in this huge development in Monaco, and we could see how you managed to design on a very large scale, just as much as city life, a whole development for residential and different commercial and even a museum. And once again, you managed to be within 2 giants like Arata and Daniel Libeskind, and this must have been another challenge to combine. Was this a master plan that was conceived always by Daniel Libeskind's studio and Arata Isozaki together? Did you work an inner competition as we did during the City Life competition?
Yeah, it was similar to City Life, yes. With Libeskind we developed many kind of idea, and especially Libeskind designed the main shape of the islands and so on. But on the other side, we gave the idea of the main channel in the center. As you saw in the presentation, we designed a big channel in the center, like Venice, to give the impression of Venice, the city of Venice, also in Monaco. So we mixed different ideas. We started from the first sketch of Daniel, and then we added this concept. Then we developed the height of the building altogether, because we divided which building we design and were designed by Libeskind. So then putting all together, the system works well, because when you make such a big project, it's boring that only one architect design all the building, because it's impossible for one architect to have so different kind of idea at the same time. And it's better to give the impression of an interesting urban complexity, no? With different kind of buildings and different kind of interpretation of apartments and hotels and so on.
It enriches so much the urban fabric.
Yes,
and
because the beauty...
that was one of the key issues why I think our group won in 2004 the City Life competition. 4 architects leading different buildings, and managing to have a dialogue.
Yeah. You know, the city are interesting when they have an interesting complexity. Can you imagine if you walk in a city that is always the same, designed by the same architect? It would be boring, no? The idea also in city life was to make an archipelago of architecture that works together and give the complexity of the city and the fascinating of to see different kind of things from different angles. Only when the urban space is a space that you discover little by little, then it's fascinating for you. If it's a space that is always the same, you don't have to discover anything, then it's not interesting, I think. So this complexity of the archipelago is the most interesting thing when we design a master plan.
We have you on this very special campus that we managed to walk around in Universidad Francisco Marroquín. And we really appreciate your presence here. We certainly hope that you will manage to find some space in your future so as to visit us, and you're always welcome. And we hope that we manage to engage in some other adventure in terms of designing. Thank you so much for being with us, Andrea.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I wish to see you soon again here in Guatemala.